Hello students, in this video I will be explaining how to use Excel Solver to solve a linear programming problem. Assume that we have a usual problem. We have, for example, to maximize an objective function z equal 3x minus 4y, for example, subject to some constraints. And assume also that some of the constraints are that the variables x and y need to be greater or equal than 0, cannot be negative. So assume that I have a problem like this and we want to use Excel Solver. So I'm going to follow several steps for doing that. Obviously, verify first that the add-in Solver has been downloaded for your Excel. You are able to use Solver in your Excel. Let's see the moment when I'm getting the solution of the problem. So as a first step, choose what cells will be the cells for the variables. So this A2 and this B2 will be the cells for the variables x and y. Then, as a second step, choose what will be the cell for the objective function. And in my case, this will be this one, z. And I'm going to type here the objective function, that is 3x minus 4y. Don't forget to type the equal sign, so it will be equal 3 times a2, and I'm going to click here in a2, minus 4 times b2, and I'm going to type here b2, and I'm going to press enter. Obviously, because I have not typing anything here in a2 and b2, so when Excel made the computation, they give me the value of 0 after I press enter. So this will be the second step. The third step will be choose the cell for the constraint and type the constraint without the right side, so just the constraint functions. For example, here will be x minus 2y. So here I'm going to choose this for the cell F2. So it will be equal, don't forget the equal, and this will be x, that is this cell A2, minus 2 times B2, and this is B2, that is the cell for y, and press enter. Obviously, because these two cells are 0 at the moment, so they will be, the value for this constraint will be 0 when you press enter. And then do the same with the second one, x plus 2y, so type just equal x, that is A2, plus 2 times, don't forget the times, b2, that is y, and press enter. And again, here will be 0. The value will be 0 because x and y so far they are 0. And finally, 2x plus 3y equal less or equal than 6. So just type 2 times x plus 3 times y. Don't forget the equal at the beginnings, the equal signs at the beginning. So it will be equals 2 times a2 plus 3 times b2, and press enter. Obviously, because a2 and b2 are 0, so all these constraints so far are 0. So this is the third step. So first, choosing the variable. Second, choose the objective function. And third, type the constraint. Now that you have done that, click here in data and then solver. After you click solver, it opens the solver window. By default, the cursor is here in the objective function. If no, you can click there in the objectives. So that in this part of the solver window, and the first parameter will be where is the cell for the objective function, and the objective function is this one. You can click there on the objective function, and appears the D2. Appears the name of the spreadsheet. Remember, choosing that is a maximize problem, so you are going to maximize. You should click here. By default is there, and by changing variables, so you are going to click with the cursor there and then choose what will be the variable that will be changing, the variable that actually we are using, x and y. So this, you should choose both, yeah, and they appears here, a2, b2, and then type the constraint. Before adding whatever constraint, you need to click here add. So you click add, and then the first constraint is the cell F2. So click in this cell F2. The sign that will be there will be less or equal. That by default is less or equal. And then type 2. So you type 2 and then OK. When you do that, appears the first constraint. Then for the second constraint, again, add. The second constraint is here in F3, click in F3, less or equal, and the constraint is 4. So it will be this x plus 2y need to be less or equal than 4. So type here 4 in this part of the window, and then OK. And that include the second constraint in the solver parameters window. And then add again, because we have another one, and this will be here in F3. So in F4, sorry. And then in S4, less or equal, and this need to be 6. And OK. Just verify that the numbers are OK. 2, 4, and 6 appears in the constraint. Make sure that this is selected, main or constraint variable non-negative, because here in this problem the variables are non-negative, are more greater or equal than 0. And by default, solver use this simplest LP, but if you don't see simplest LP, choose simplest LP in the set of options that appears here. So in this case, it appears GRG non-linear, in case this is non-linear problem. This is a linear problem. This is a simplest LP problem. Linear programming problem, just this linear programming problem. Simplest linear programming. And then solve. The cell gives you the solution of the problem. This is the maximum value of z. This is the value of x and y that make this value z maximum. And this is 6.57. And here again, these are the value of the constraints given this value of x and y. You can keep solver solution, just press OK. Okay, so this explains how to use Excel. Let's summarize this. As a first step, identify some cells of interest that are going to be used as variables. One cell per each variable. For example, in this case, we have the variable x and y, and this is just a part of the Excel spreadsheet. In these examples, the variables are going to be A2 and B2. And notice that A1 and B2 are just the labels. This will be one cell for the first variable, then it will be the cell for the variable x, and these cells will correspond to the variable y. Okay, so that's the first step. Choose some cells of interest that are going to be used as variables. So this cell will be the variable x, this cell will be the variable y. Second, identify a cell for the objective function. So this objective function 3x minus 4y will be in one cell. So and I'm going to identify this cell here, D2. So and again, I'm going to use D1 as the label for the objective function. This variable z will be written in terms of the cell that you were choosing as variable. For example, in this case, you use the z is equal to 3x minus 4y. So z will be 3a2, that is the cell for the variable x, minus 4 times b2, that is the cells corresponding to the variable y. So type it here. It will be 3 times a2 minus 4 times b2. And press enter. When you press enter, this expression disappears. And third, you are going to identify some cells, and when you are going to type this constraint functions, this one, for example, x minus 2y, obviously you need to type this in terms of the cells corresponding to x and the cells corresponding to y, so a1, a2, and b2. So you are going to type a2 minus 2 times b2, for example, for this first function here. I'm using f1 as the label, but f2 will be my first constraint, f3 my second constraint, and f4 my third constraint. So here will be equal a2 minus 2 times b2. That corresponds to this function, x minus 2 times y. The second one will be equal, don't forget the equals, a2 plus 2 times b2. So it will be a2 plus 2 times b2. And the last one will be 2 times A2 plus 3 times B2. So equal, don't forget the equal, 2 times A2 plus 3 times B2. In each case, you press enter. So now you have the 3 constraints, and now you can start thinking in open solver at that time. Okay, so when you have to type in the constraint, and when you type the constraint, you don't need to type the right side of the constraint. Yeah, so the number that is at the right side after the symbol. As a first step, you are going to open solver, and for doing that, click here in data. So as you click here, it will open a set of options. If you have downloaded solver, you are going to see this solver. If no, you will need to download solver first. Click in solver. After you click this solver, the solver window will open. So this solver window will require some information. If you put the cursor here and click on the cell corresponding to the objective function, it will appear here D2. Okay? Remember that D2 was the cell corresponding to the objective function. And here in this part, you are going to type the cells corresponding to the variables. Variable X in the cell A2 and variables Y is in the cell B2. You can put your cursor here and select the cells, and you're going to see that they appear here, B2, B2. In this part, you will need to choose if you need to maximize the objective function or you need to minimize. Because in this function I need to maximize, I choose here. And here you need to add the constraint. Remember the cell for constraint was F2, F3 and F4. So before adding each of them, you need to click here in add. So click in add before adding each constraint, and after you click in this add, will open a set of options that it looks like this. In this new window that appears, small window, you need to type the cells reference where is the constraint. For example, the first constraint was in F2. You can choose what signs the constraint could have, a less or equal, a more or equal, or can have also an equal signs. In this case, we have a less or equal, so you choose less or equal. That by default, this is the one that appears. And the constraint, it will be the number at the right. That is the moment when you type the number of at the right, number 2, for example. For the first constraint will be 2, and press OK as soon as you have this constraint. Then you need to click add again. So when you fill the first constraint, it looks like this. When you fill the window corresponding to the first constraint, it will look like this. I choose less or equal as the sign for the constraint, and then number 2, that is the number at the right in the constraint. After you press OK, appears the first constraint. Then you should click add for the second constraint, etc. To make the variables non-negative, greater or equal than 0, you just click here. So click here to add the non-negative constraint, x greater or equal than 0, y greater or equal than 0. Then, as a sixth step, choose the simplest linear programming and click solve. So you will need to choose this simplest LP and then click solve. This part here. So after some moment of computation, because the cell will be spending some time, will provide an answer in the variable set of the value of the variables that optimize this objective function. So a cell will give you the value of the variable that optimize the objective function. Another cell will provide the optimum value of the objective function in the corresponding cell. So it will appear this way. That will be the maximum value for Z, and this maximum value will happen when the value of X is this, 2.57, and the value of Y is 0.29, around 0.29. So the maximum value for Z is 6.57. And obviously, with this value of X and Y, they will be the values of the constraint. For example, if X is this if X have this value and Y have this value, the second constraint, the first constraint is equal to. And Remember, this needs to be less or equal than 2. So it takes the maximum value, by the way, that could for this constraint. And for the second constraint, 3.14. If you make a substitution of x and y in the second constraint, the value will be 3.14. So that means that the second constraint is not get to the maximum value for. Yeah? And if you do the same in the third constraint, 2 times x plus 3y, the value will be 6. So the third constraint will take the maximum possible value.